Hello, I'm iPoSwords, and today I'm going to be talking to you about irresponsible restoration of antiques, and I'm going to be doing so through the use of an example. This antique bollock dagger from approximately the year 1490. As far as me or any of the experts I've consulted can tell, this is indeed an authentic antique. However, being an authentic antique does not mean it has not been molested. If I move it into the light, you will note that the blade, despite being deeply pitted, has been highly polished. Whether this was accomplished via an abrasive sandpaper, or a whetstone, or a polishing compound, is difficult to say. However, I venture it would have had to have been something hard-backed, because all of the pitting still remains. So it wasn't something like media blasting. This was an irresponsible polish job on what is a legitimately very old antique. However, as a result of this highly polished blade, much of the context of this dagger has been lost. When talking about the context of an antique, I'm primarily talking about two different sorts of context, both of which are not present with this antique. The first and most common way we talk about the context of an antique is the context of the find. For many finds, this means the strata or stratified layer of soil in which it was found. This can indicate the age, the location, and the conditions in which it was preserved. For example, this, being either Flemish or Netherlandish, was most likely a canal find. It would have been dredged up at some point or perhaps magnet fished. Being a canal find, it would have been encased in one of the silt strata of that canal. Silt, being very fine dirt, is pretty inhibitive of corrosion causing oxygen, and as a result, we typically find pretty well conserved items, whether they're ferrous or wood, in silt finds. A similar situation can occur in bogs or in particular soils which are low in acidity. However, as I've said, this object was removed from its context, and its context was not documented. I do not have provenance for this dagger. I cannot point to a map and say where it came from. I cannot go and visit the location and have a look at other items in that stratified layer to perhaps contextualize it better. But that's not the only contextual information we can get from an antique. The other form is the context that is on the antique. For example, a freshly excavated antique will most likely be covered in layers of corrosion and dirt or mud or silt or water from the location from which it was taken. And this can tell us a lot about the antique. One of the main things it tells us is the age, because a lot of those contain organic materials which can be carbon dated if you have the funds to do so. The other thing they show us is that it is actually an antique removed from a historical context and not a fake. You see, this could very well be a well-made fake, using proper bloomery steel for the blade, proper wrought iron for the guard, and either dogwood or another fruit tree wood root for the hilt. Because it's possible to competently make fakes like this if you have the right investment of time and energy, it's also possible to fake the aging on them. Whether this is done chemically through an accelerated process with acids, salts, and other solutions, or whether it is physically done in order to emulate the appearance of pits by grinding them in and then corroding it, it matters little. What matters is that by removing it from its historical context, not documenting the context, and then overcleaning it, it's very difficult to prove whether something is an antique. If you leave the contextual signs, like corrosion products, on the blade, yes, some collectors may be dissuaded because it looks poorly conserved or unrestored. But other collectors, in particular museums, favor being able to see the consequences of age and its conservation context on the blade, or indeed on the hilt or guard or any other part of an antique. It does not need to be arms and armor. I will note there are cultural aspects to how antiques are treated and whether they are restored in one way or another. In this case, I would have preferred, being from a Western antique collecting culture, to have seen it with its corrosion products intact, perhaps removed some of them by EDTA chelation or the use of another chemical exfoliant process which is very mild, perhaps oxalic acid. But there are cultures in which polishing of blades is extremely common. This is a Japanese wakizashi, a short sword, and it, like most Japanese swords, comes in an extremely high polish. This is done in a multi-stage process and is often redone even on old blades. In fact, it's quite rare to find a Japanese sword, particularly in Japan, which is not in good polish, despite this being a very expensive process. This blade has numerous flaws on it, not in the form of cracks, but in the form of inclusions and open welds. Therefore, it is not a particularly valuable sword. However, it is still kept in impeccable polish. The difference in cultural standards for conservation does come down to one very large difference in the preservation of history in the case of Japanese swords. Many of them are signed, and even when they are not signed, the tang is invariably left untouched. The nakago or tang of nihonto Japanese swords often has very thick layers of corrosion on it, and these act as indicators of age. What's more, they were also crosshatched in a particular way when they were made, which can be seen at different layers of corrosion to indicate the age, compared to plain steel which corrodes evenly. By texturing them in this way, there is more friction on the hilt when it's inserted, yes, and that has functional benefits, but there's also more information provided about the age based on the topography of the surface. Now, I'm not particularly blaming the seller of my bollock dagger, because I know they're not the person who did the restoration. I've seen other items that they've had for sale that have been in vastly different conditions, because they simply buy and resell antiques. They are, at most, a collector who was sold a poorly restored dagger. I do want to raise blame on the person who did restore this dagger, but I don't know who they are, and I have no way of finding out. What they did is fundamentally destroy roughly 500 years of history, albeit in a millimeter thin layer, over the entire surface of that antique dagger. What they did is remove context from an item which was already removed from its original context. There was no documentation provided on either the historical context from which it was removed or on the restoration process, and indeed there was also no attempt to make sure that the restoration was reversible. Although I will note that in terms of ferrous artifacts, reversibility is almost never possible. In fact, we can't even be certain that the hilt, the wooden component, is original because there is no documentation of the repair process. One thing we can glean from the hilt is an understanding of whether it has been repaired, and that's possible through the use of UV illumination. UV illumination, for example, can reveal that several of the infill layers here are fluorescent under a UV light, and this fluorescence may indicate that the infill was done modernly. It could also have been done quite a while back, as many adhesives and lacquers and such become fluorescent over time. Had I the funds, I could scrape some of this infill and send it off for mass spectrometry in order to determine what it's made from. However, being the average collector, I do not. What I do have is a dagger which mostly does not fluoresce in terms of the organic components, apart from a small line around each piece of wooden infill. The wooden infill does not perfectly match the rest of the hilt, however, it does not fluoresce. So this may be original infill on what was a very knotted or burly hilt. Now, I'm not saying that this particular antique has been completely destroyed by irresponsible restoration. At most, roughly a millimeter of surface corrosion was removed from it in a rather even manner, leaving all of the highlights polished and all of the depressions or lowlights, to call them, still deeply pitted. However, my example is not the only example of an irresponsibly restored antique, whether it's arms and armor or any other sort of antique. We constantly see them come up at auction, and indeed we see them poorly restored on websites like this, where fake restorations of even real antiques are very common. Restorations in which someone who has no right to touch antiques or modern reproductions aged to look like antiques take it through a process which has nothing to do with actual responsible restoration. The use of irresponsible abrasive methods means that you remove pretty large amounts of the surface texture of an item like this. I know that I've made videos on this topic before. Indeed, I've made videos on fake antiques before, as well as irresponsible restorations. But now, owning one myself, and in this particular state, where it's visible that there is old pitting and new overpolishing, it is brought to light that this problem continues, and it is growing, because more and more people see these irresponsible restorations and emulate them on items they may own themselves, whether they've been purchased at a flea market, inherited, or purchased at an auction, and then enthusiastically but uneducatedly restored. This decimates not only the financial value, which is secondary, but the historical value of an antique. There is a limited number of antique bollock daggers in the world, as there is of any antique, and the destruction of each of them is inherently damaging to our understanding of material history. To continue to advocate these irresponsible restorations by uplifting them on algorithms, by liking them, commenting on them, watching them, we, even as consumers, perpetuate these very damaging ideas which lead to the destruction of historical material examples of our culture. If you own an antique, seek professional advice on how to restore it, how to conserve it, and whether it even needs restoration. There are many situations I've seen where someone is asking for restoration advice when the truly responsible thing would be to simply oil it continuously and wipe it down with a cloth until it stops coming up with active rust, just to stabilize it. Oil and then perhaps Renaissance wax is the only thing that those antiques need. But people will pursue corrosion as though it is the bane of their existence until they are left with a as new polished item, which in the case of a pitted item means removing a large amount of its historical context. I'm going to be following up this video with actual videos covering each of the antiques behind me, the wakizashi and the bollock dagger. So don't worry if there have been no close-ups in this video. Both of them will be thoroughly examined at the tabletop, measured, and all of the measurements will be publicly available, as well as high-definition close-ups of their surfaces, their features, and their decoration. However, this video is purely about the ethics of restoration. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this mild rant, because that's all I have for you today. Until next time, stay sharp.